What happens when one of politics' fastest rising stars collides head-on with one of television's most seasoned journalists? What was supposed to be a calm morning interview on national TV quickly spiraled into a fiery clash that no one saw coming. Words turned sharp, tempers flared, and what began as a routine book promotion ended with a confrontation so intense it left the studio stunned and viewers everywhere replaying the moment. This wasn't just an interview, it was a battle that exposed far more than either side expected. Before we dive deeper into this wild confrontation, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss explosive stories like this one. Every click helps us bring you the biggest behind the scenes political moments the mainstream doesn't want you to see. Now, let's rewind and set the stage for how this clash even happened, because the background is just as fascinating as the blow up itself. Karoline Leavitt didn't just walk into the Good Morning America studio as another guest hoping to sell a book. She walked in carrying the weight of her rapid and controversial rise in American politics. At only 27 years old, she has gone from a name few outside New Hampshire recognize to one of the most talked about young conservative voices in the country. Her story has often been framed as the tale of a political outsider, someone from a working class community who refuses to conform to the mold of establishment politics. To her supporters, she is a fighter who speaks directly to forgotten Americans. To her critics, she is an opportunist who mastered outrage politics at record speed. Either way, her presence on a national stage is impossible to ignore. On this particular morning, the GMA studio was buzzing with its usual energy. Producers scrambled behind the scenes, shuffling papers and double-checking earpieces. To them, this was supposed to be straightforward. Another light interview promoting a political book, a few polite questions, some rehearsed talking points, and then on to the next segment. What they didn't realize was that this setup, with Karoline Leavitt on one side of the table and George Stephanopoulos on the other, had all the makings of television history. Stephanopoulos, of course, is no stranger to high-pressure interviews. A former White House insider turned seasoned political journalist, he carries decades of experience in asking tough questions and keeping control of the room. But that morning, he underestimated the firestorm that was about to unfold. Across from him sat a young politician with nothing to lose, determined to prove that the establishment couldn't intimidate her. As the cameras rolled, the conversation started innocently enough. Stephanopoulos smiled into the lens with his trademark professionalism, welcoming Karoline to the show. She responded with the confidence of someone who had done countless interviews before. At first glance, it looked like it would be smooth sailing, a polished host and a rising star having a civil conversation about her new book, Another Conservative Manifesto. But it didn't take long for cracks to show. The first shift came when Stephanopoulos questioned her consistency. He suggested that her book was less about presenting fresh ideas and more about recycling old conservative talking points dressed up as something new. It was a standard critique, one she had likely heard before, but this time her reaction was different. Viewers could see her smile tighten, her posture shift, and the edge creep into her voice. She fired back that critics needed to actually read the book before dismissing it. Her tone carried more bite than anyone expected, and the mood in the studio immediately changed. Behind the cameras, producers began to exchange nervous glances. This wasn't the kind of lighthearted back and forth they had planned. Stephanopoulos, sensing the tension, leaned in. Instead of backing off, he doubled down, pressing her on whether her political persona was simply a character, a young conservative from New Hampshire positioning herself as the savior of forgotten Americans. The implication was clear. Was she authentic, or was she just playing a role for political gain? For a brief second, there was silence. No witty comeback, no smooth transition, just a pause that made everyone watching feel the weight of the question. Karoline's reply was sharp and direct. Maybe the issue wasn't her consistency, she argued, but Washington's inability to understand authenticity in the first place. It wasn't the kind of polished answer expected in morning television. It was raw, personal, and it set the stage for what was about to spiral out of control. From that moment on, the dynamic shifted. What should have been a safe, controlled interview suddenly felt like a showdown. Stephanopoulos' journalist instincts were fully activated, and Karoline's determination to push back grew stronger with every exchange. The early signs of confrontation were already brewing, and anyone watching could sense it. But here's the thing, this was just the opening act. What unfolded next would completely flip the script and transform a standard book promotion into one of the most unforgettable morning show interviews in recent memory. Because when questions turned from policy talking points to personal responsibility, the real fireworks began. The moment George Stephanopoulos shifted gears and brought up Karoline Leavitt's responsibility as a rising political figure, everything changed. What had been sharp but manageable debates suddenly caught fire. Responsibility. It wasn't just a word, it was a challenge. An insinuation that her rapid rise in politics came without the maturity, wisdom, or experience needed to handle it. For a politician who prides herself on being underestimated and proving people wrong, this wasn't a question. It was an insult wrapped in politeness. Stephanopoulos framed it carefully. He asked whether her meteoric rise, going from relative obscurity to a national platform in just a few short years, wasn't a little irresponsible. Was she moving too fast? Did she risk misleading the very young voters who looked up to her? The studio grew quiet. Even the camera crew seemed to sense the tension pulsing through the air. For Leavitt, the implication that she might be reckless was a red line. Her voice dropped lower, calmer than anyone expected, but that calmness carried a dangerous weight. She asked him if he had ever fought for his political life. Had he ever lived in a community where being heard wasn't about privilege or platform, but about survival? She drew a sharp line between her lived experience and the elite world Stephanopoulos represented. For a split second, he seemed caught off guard, but rather than easing up, his instincts as a journalist kicked in harder. He pressed again, saying that wasn't the point. The issue, he argued, wasn't her background. It was the massive influence she now carried. That's when the back and forth truly ignited. Karoline accused Washington of being out of touch, of dismissing authenticity and silencing voices like hers. Stephanopoulos countered with questions about her growing platform, hammering home the idea that with great power comes great responsibility. But to Leavitt, these weren't neutral questions. They were loaded, designed to paint her as reckless, even dangerous. And in that moment, her New Hampshire fire came roaring to the surface. She leaned forward in her chair, the edges of her words sharpening. "What I owe them," she said of her supporters, "is honesty. What I owe them is showing them you can challenge the system." The words hit like a strike across the polished professionalism of morning TV. She wasn't here to play the game of carefully worded sound bites and safe answers. She was here to fight. Stephanopoulos, refusing to give ground, went for a different angle. Contradiction. He accused her of profiting off the very establishment she attacked. Wasn't her growing fame, her book deal, her media appearances proof that she had become part of the machine she claimed to oppose? It was the kind of gotcha line that might corner a less experienced guest. But instead of trapping her, it detonated the interview. Leavitt shot up from her chair so suddenly that the studio crew froze in place. Her chair rolled back, nearly toppling. She locked eyes with Stephanopoulos and let her frustration boil over. "Profit," she snapped. "Let's talk about profit. Let's talk about how news networks profit off division, how media commentators profit off keeping people angry. At least when I fight, people know whose side I'm on." The studio air grew thick with the weight of her words. Stephanopoulos stayed seated, but his voice rose to match her intensity. He argued that wasn't the same thing, that journalism, for all its flaws, was about accountability. She fired back that what he called journalism looked more like manufacturing controversy to generate clicks. The polished back and forth had dissolved into open combat, and everyone watching could feel it. For the first time in the interview, George Stephanopoulos looked rattled. He adjusted his tie, his composure cracking under the pressure, yet he refused to back down. He accused her of dodging real scrutiny, of trying to escape whenever the questions got tough. To a young politician like Leavitt, the word he chose was poison. He called her a quitter. That single word was the spark that set the room ablaze. Her face tightened. Her voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than shouting ever could. She told him straight, if there was one thing she had never been in her career, it was a quitter. She listed the battles she had fought, being told she was too young, too inexperienced, too brash, yet never walking away. And now, standing in that studio, she declared she would not let his label define her. By this point, the interview wasn't about a book or even policy. It had become a raw battle of wills. On one side, the seasoned journalist leaning on years of authority and credibility. On the other, a fiery newcomer determined to prove that establishment credentials meant nothing compared to lived struggle and unfiltered honesty. The crew didn't dare cut to commercial. The moment was too electric. Millions of viewers at home sat glued to their screens, sensing they were watching something far beyond a routine morning show. This was a cultural collision. Old media versus new politics. Experience versus defiance. Polish versus authenticity. And the tension wasn't just rising, it was about to explode. Because when Stephanopoulos accused her one last time of playing divisive politics, Karoline Leavitt didn't just push back. She turned the entire interview on its head. And what came next would turn a heated debate into one of the most unforgettable moments in live television history. The word quitter was like gasoline poured on open flames. Karoline Leavitt froze for a split second, her hand still on the microphone microphone clip before slowly turning back toward George Stephanopoulos. The look on her face sent a chill through the studio. She wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't sparring with clever lines. She was furious, and the dangerous calm in her voice made it clear that this interview had crossed into uncharted territory. "You think I'm running away?" she asked, her tone quiet but dripping with menace. The silence in the studio was so absolute that even the hum of the cameras seemed louder. Stephanopoulos, trying to maintain his authority, insisted that he was simply holding her accountable, but his voice cracked just enough to betray the pressure he was under. Karoline, sensing weakness, closed the distance between them. She didn't sit back down. Instead, she loomed over his desk, challenging him not just with words, but with presence. What followed was less an interview than a speech. Part defense, part declaration of war. She reminded him of every moment in her career when people dismissed her as too young, too inexperienced, too fiery to last. She spoke about growing up in a working-class community where politics wasn't an abstract debate, but a fight for survival. She framed herself not as a politician chasing fame, but as a fighter representing people who had no voice in Washington. Her voice rose with each sentence, the fire building as she contrasted her battles with Stephanopoulos' comfortable career behind a studio desk. "What have you built, George?" she demanded. "What have you created that didn't exist before you came along?" "I built a movement. I built a platform for people who've been ignored for decades. And you sit here judging me for daring to succeed outside your establishment system." The crew exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or let history unfold. Stephanopoulos tried to interject, insisting that journalism was about asking difficult questions. But his words were drowned out by Karoline's momentum. She accused him of coming into the interview with a narrative already written, of seeking a viral clash rather than an honest discussion. Her accusations weren't just aimed at him, they were aimed at the entire mainstream media establishment, and millions watching at home knew exactly what she meant. Stephanopoulos, perhaps realizing the optics slipping away, attempted to reset the conversation. He suggested they return to her book, to talk about her ideas, rather than clash over personalities. But Karoline wasn't having it. She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "Start over? After 20 minutes of tearing me down, you want to start over? No, George. This is who you are. This is what you do. You don't inform people anymore. You entertain them. You manufacture outrage because conflict sells." At that point, the host's mask of composure cracked fully. His responses grew shorter, sharper, almost defensive. He denied her accusations, but his denials sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The power dynamic had shifted. Karoline wasn't the guest anymore. She was in control. She turned to the camera, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I think people are smart enough to know the difference between advocacy and propaganda. I think they're smart enough to see when someone's fighting for them and when someone's just trying to get clicks. So let's be clear, I didn't come here to play a part in George's rating strategy. I came here to fight for policies that matter. And if the price of telling the truth is being attacked on live television, then so be it." The studio audience, stunned into silence earlier, now leaned forward. Even those who disagreed with her politically couldn't look away. The raw passion in her voice commanded attention. It was the kind of moment that transcends partisan lines. Not because everyone agreed with her, but because no one could deny the sheer force of will she projected. Then came the climax. She unclipped her microphone with deliberate precision, the metallic click echoing in the studio like a gunshot. But before walking out, she delivered one final blow. Looking George directly in the eyes, she said, "Next time you want to question my work, George, try reading it first. You might actually learn something about real people and real struggles." With that, she set the mic down on his desk and turned her back to him. The cameras followed as she walked toward the exit, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Stephanopoulos sat frozen, gripping his index card so tightly his knuckles turned white. The producers, finally snapping into action, began signaling frantically to cut to commercial. But it was too late. The moment had already burned itself into television history. For several long seconds, George sat alone at his desk, visibly shaken. Finally, he looked into the camera and muttered, "We'll be right back after this break." But everyone watching knew the truth. Nothing would be the same after what had just happened. The clip exploded across social media within hours. Some hailed Karoline as a fearless warrior who exposed the arrogance of mainstream journalism. Others criticized her as unhinged, reckless, and dangerous. The debate raged, with hashtags trending worldwide. Was she a truth teller who stood her ground, or a volatile young politician who proved her critics right. The only thing everyone agreed on was that the interview had turned into one of the most unforgettable clashes in recent political memory, and that left one big question hanging in the air. Was this the moment that cemented Karoline Leavitt's place as a new kind of political force, or the moment that revealed the cracks in her armor? Karoline Leavitt's explosive clash with George Stephanopoulos wasn't just a fiery exchange on live television. It became a mirror reflecting something much bigger about politics, media, and generational power in America. What started as a supposedly routine book promotion turned into a cultural lightning rod, exposing fault lines that had been building for years. On one side, you had George Stephanopoulos, the polished veteran of old-school journalism. He represented the establishment, decades of experience, institutional authority, and a belief that tough questioning is the gold standard of holding public figures accountable. On the other, you had Karoline Leavitt, the young insurgent, brash and unapologetic, carrying herself as the voice of people who feel ignored by that very establishment. Their collision was inevitable. The only surprise was how public, raw, and unforgettable it became. The question of responsibility, Stephanopoulos' central theme, was not an accident. It was the heart of the clash. To him, the danger wasn't her age or her background, but the enormous influence she had already amassed. Millions of people, especially younger audiences, listen to her message, share her posts, buy her book, and view her as a model of defiance against the system. From the perspective of an established journalist, that makes her words more than personal. They're political weapons with consequences. His attempt to frame her as irresponsible was, at least in his mind, a matter of public accountability. But to Karoline, the word carried a different weight. For someone who has fought to prove she belongs in a field dominated by older, wealthier, more connected figures, irresponsible was a dismissal, a reduction of her struggles to nothing more than recklessness. Her refusal to sit back and let that narrative define her wasn't just about defending her book, it was about defending her entire identity as a political force. That's why her response was so visceral, so uncompromising. What made the confrontation so riveting wasn't just the words exchanged, it was the symbolism. Every time Stephanopoulos leaned on his credentials, Karoline hit back with authenticity. Every time he framed her rise as a contradiction, she turned the spotlight back on the media's contradictions. The clash wasn't just between two people, it was between two eras. Old media versus new politics, institutional authority versus grassroots fire, polished diplomacy versus raw defiance. And when Karoline stood up, literally rising from her chair to tower over the host, the power dynamics shifted before the eyes of millions. For years, morning television has been the safe, controlled arena of establishment voices. But in that moment, a young outsider shattered the illusion of control. Her walk-off wasn't just a dramatic exit, it was a statement, a rejection of the rules of the game, and a promise to her supporters that she would never bow to the system, even when it meant burning bridges on live television. The aftermath has only magnified the moment. Clips spread across social platforms within hours, dissected by commentators on both sides of the aisle. Supporters framed her as a fearless truth teller, a politician unafraid to stare down one of the most seasoned interviewers in the country. Critics, however, saw recklessness, a refusal to engage in real dialogue, and a dangerous precedent for leaders who reject accountability. The debate has become less about the specifics of the book and more about what this interview revealed: the raw tension between authenticity and responsibility in modern politics. What's undeniable is that Karoline Leavitt walked out of that studio with her profile bigger than ever. Whether you see her as a hero or a cautionary tale, she succeeded in forcing people to pay attention. And in politics, attention is power. George Stephanopoulos, meanwhile, walked away looking shaken, perhaps for the first time in his career, facing a guest who refused to play by the rules of television civility. In many ways, both got what they wanted. He got the viral confrontation, she got the rallying cry. But at what cost? Because here's the deeper question: was this the kind of authenticity voters crave, or the kind of volatility that undermines leadership? Is a refusal to back down a sign of strength or a red flag for instability? The answer depends on who you ask, and that's why this moment will continue to echo far beyond one morning interview. As viewers, we're left to grapple with the bigger picture. In an era where politics feels like performance and media feels like theater, where do we draw the line between holding someone accountable and manufacturing outrage? Was George right to press so hard, or did he cross into ambush territory? Was Karoline right to walk away, or did she prove her critics correct? The truth may lie somewhere in the messy middle, but the impact is undeniable. One thing is certain: this wasn't just television, it was history, a clash that revealed revealed not just the personalities of two people, but the shifting landscape of American politics and media. The old guard is being challenged by a new generation that doesn't play by the same rules. And whether you cheer or cringe, you can't look away. So what do you think? Was Karoline Leavitt standing up for authenticity and exposing media bias? Or did she hand her critics exactly the ammunition they were waiting for? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them, and I want to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown as fascinating as I did, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next time politics collides with media in a way nobody saw coming. Trust me, this story isn't over.